There you go. Oh, also Friday, I'll have you turn in your bell ringers for this week. So I'll have an assignment just like normal, or you can just attach those bell ringers for the week. Okay, that will be Friday. So make sure you do that. You can just complete the assignment that I have for the superhero functions of the brain, create your own superhero villain, whatever, and then you're just going to attach your bell ringers for Friday. Go ahead, Connor. You all finished? Okay. All right, so let's get to it here. Basic functions of the limbic system. What are they? What are they? Kiara, what do you have? All right, okay, good job. So when you're looking underneath the cerebral cortex, which we're going to be talking about today, when you look at the brain, that's what you really focus on, the cerebral cortex. The limbic system is that internal part, the internal bladder, I guess you could say, of the cerebral cortex. Its main functions really is just memory and emotion. Okay, so let's talk about the parts that we mentioned yesterday. So let's go with the hypothalamus. What main functions the hypothalamus perform? Allison, you have that? The hypothalamus?
It analyzes blood flow and helps regulate body temperature, fluid levels, and nutrients.
Yeah, good job. So homeostasis, right? So with blood pressure, okay, really just temperature of the body, hunger, thirst, you name it. Good job. So that kind of branches up from the brainstem. The thalamus, we know, is it receiving all this incoming information, the sensory information, sending to different parts of the brain where it can be processed. Hypothalamus, again, homeostasis. That's the main function. Good. What's another one we mentioned yesterday? What's another function of the limbic system? How about the hippocampus? Hippocampi. Hadley, what do you have?
It relates emotion, experience, and
Okay, yeah, good job. So they branch off of the hypothalamus, okay, and it relates past memories, emotions, right, experiences to present. And it relates a lot with sensation, okay, that's really focused underneath the sensory cortex. It's related well with the sensory cortex. So that's why I gave that example yesterday. When you walk into a restaurant, you smell the aroma, you know exactly what you want. Okay, I know when I go to Burger King, I'm going to get one of those crispy chicken sandwiches. I love those, the Chick Kings. Right? You ever get one of those, Christians? No, you never had a Chick King. What? What about a Whopper? You like Whoppers? Okay, all right, there you go. And you know the number for that? I know I go to, yeah, on the menu. Hey, okay, yeah. Isn't it weird how you can just know the number of the item on the menu? I know when I go into McDonald's, it's like, oh, number one, Big Mac. It's like, it's weird. You shouldn't just know that. But anyway, it is what it is. But with the hippocampus, hippocampi relates past memories, emotions, and how we can relate it to our current experience. Good job. And then finally, what else should we talk about? The amygdala, right? What about the amygdala? Parts and function, Raven?
Most of it regulates emotions like the spirit, excitement of the portrait.
Yeah, good job. Good job. So it branches off the hippocampi, right? There's a small sphere, almost pea-like shape off the hippocampi. And yeah, so different forms of emotion. So reward center, okay, fear. I guess you could say anxiety, stress related in this part of the brain. Okay, so again, emotion expressed with this part of the limbic system. I think we also talked about the cerebellum, right? Okay, cerebellum focused a lot with the brainstem, limbic system, but what is the basic function of the cerebellum? Caitlin? Yeah, balance, coordination, posture. Okay, and where's that focused? Back the brain, right? Okay, they call it the small brain, I guess you could say, because it really looks like a smaller version of the cerebral cortex. And like I said yesterday, I thought it was interesting, 50% of the neural connections occur in the cerebellum, which is interesting to think about. All right, good. So limbic system, make sure you guys remember it. It's going to be on the quiz for Monday. All right, terms for today. Not that. There's too many classes here. I tell you what. This one here? Yeah, there we go. So I don't know if we'll get to the Broca's area or the Wernicke's area, but frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal, and occipital. So those are the main lobes we're going to talk about today. And then, like I said, tomorrow, I was going to have your quiz for tomorrow, but I'd like to break this up a little bit more and talk about the Wernicke's area, the Broca's area tomorrow, and certain examples and stories that I think are important when it comes to aphasia, plasticity. And Friday, like I said, I'll have an activity for you. You can complete on Canvas. Turn in your bell ringers. Again, turn in those. On Monday, I'm thinking for a quiz. Next week, I'm going to assign something for you guys, just to maybe we can all collect certain items for it. I like to do this orange brain surgery where you guys work in groups. And it's really just to know and understand parts and functions of the brain a little bit more in detail. So I'm going to put up in a kind of like the list of items we need. So if you guys want to help out, that'd be great. I mean, obviously I can buy a lot of the majority of them if you want me to, but if you guys want to help out and just get a little bit of the candy or the oranges, that'd be great. think I already have paper plates and knives and toothpicks, so we're good on that end, but maybe some of the other items. So I'll talk about that more tomorrow. Okay, I'll sign that. So maybe next week we can get these items together so we can have that activity. All right, so I'll give you a couple minutes. Write these down. All right, so frontal lobe, what do we have? What do we got? What do we got? So I guess you can label the location of it. Obviously, it's pretty self-explanatory. And basic functions. What do we have here? Christian, what do you got? Christian Cage.
Frontal lobe, which address the forehead. Frontal lobe, the largest lobe in the brain, and they are also the most common inclusion of injury, traumatic brain injury. Frontal lobes are considered our behavioral and emotional control center.
All right, yeah, good job. Good job. So right behind the forehead, and the frontal lobe takes a lot of the impact. Okay, so if you ever get a concussion or something, you could take a lot of the impact. I'm just joking. But it alters with really with if you ever take any impacts with planning, judgment. Okay, really just understanding. Okay, your own self, really just cognitively, understanding. Really with planning, judgment, organization. Okay, there's a lot of functions involved with the frontal lobe. All right, good job. Parietal lobe. So let's say location and basic functions. What do you have here, Brady?
It's located in the upper back area. It processes sensory.
All right, good job. So parietal lobe is located really on the top of the brain, right behind the frontal lobe, and it is really mostly associated with sensory information. So just location of the sensory cortex is located in the parietal lobe. Also, the motor cortex that's involved close to with the parietal lobe, along with the frontal lobe. And but the main function really of the parietal lobe is sensory information. So there is some other forms of organization located in the parietal lobe, but for the most part, it is with sensory information. As the sensory cortex is located right in front of the parietal lobe, along with the motor cortex. So a lot of these motor functions, okay, closely associated with the parietal lobe. All right, what about the temporal lobe? What do we have for the temporal lobe? Brittany? Okay, yeah, good job. Good job. So expressive language, we'll talk about it more with the Broca's area, the Wernicke area as well. So a lot of it has with auditory functions, okay? But you also said with vision, okay, yeah, mostly focused in the occipital lobe, which we'll talk about next. but the temporal lobe has a lot of functions with expressive language and receptive language. They're located on the side of the brain, obviously your temples, right? Your temporal lobe. Okay, good. And then finally we have what? We have the occipital lobe. Katie, what do you have for the occipital lobe? Yeah, good job. Good job. So we'll get into more detail about the anatomy of the eye and some of its basic functions, but for the most part, the occipital lobe is focused with the with vision, okay, with how we perceive vision. Good. And it's right above the cerebellum. So as we're looking at it, here's the frontal lobe right behind the forehead, like I said. Again, organization, planning, judgment, you name it. Okay, the parietal lobe is located at really the top back portion of the brain. And then really between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, we have the sensory cortex along with the motor cortex. Temporal lobe, like I said, auditory functions, okay, and with really expressive language. Occipital lobe in the back of the brain right here, and that's mostly focused with vision. There's the cerebellum, like I was saying before, okay, with posture, okay, with really our movements and our balance. All right, so let's dive into a little bit more. Cerebral cortex. All right, so with the cerebral cortex, when you're looking at the brain, that's what you focus on mostly. Okay, there's fissures that separate different parts and lobes of the brain, and which allow it for it to be associated with different lobes. Gyri is really just the explanation of really the outside structure of the brain, okay, and where a lot of these neural connections are. Right, so the dendrites are focused a lot, really at the surface of the brain around the cerebral cortex. Again, if you see fissures on the test or the assessment, that is really just separating different lobes. Okay, when you're looking at the brain, that's kind of like the wrinkles within the brain. So the gyri, again, is like the folds. It's really just the outside surface of the brain, what we're looking at of the cerebral cortex. All right, so frontal lobes. So the frontal lobe, again, is split up. Okay, we'll talk about the different hemispheres of the brain and how it's split by the corpus callosum. And when we talk about the hemispheres of the brain and the corpus callosum, I think it's interesting to note with extreme seizures, sometimes the best solution to really trying to eliminate different forms of epilepsy is by cutting the corpus callosum. And that could cause a lot of damage to people, especially when it comes to association and perceiving different forms of stimulus. So through vision. Hey, Haley, what's up? All right, thanks. Do I keep this or? Okay. So again, the frontal lobe involving the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is focused right behind the frontal lobe, in between the frontal and really the sensory cortex, moving into the parietal lobe. And its main functions is really just motor movements. And I said with the frontal lobe, again, basic function is involving planning and judgment. Okay, so organizational planning, judgment, main focus for the frontal lobe. Again, right behind the forehead. The parietal lobe, again, focused on top of the brain, right behind the frontal lobe, and right behind the sensory and motor cortex. Basic is just with really sensory information, okay, even motor movements, and some mathematical reason. Still, the brain is something that we're focusing on. We're still understanding it as more studies and more forms of technology are coming out that we can actually see within inside and see exactly what types of performances are occurring through certain stimulus. So again, it's really questionable of what other processes and functions the brain can really have. So the motor cortex, again, is focused right behind the frontal lobe, and its really main performance is these motor movements. So how do we react to certain stimulus? So reflexes. And I always like to do this demo. I think it's kind of fun to do. So real quick, move your right hand in a circular motion. Okay, there you go. Now try to do the same with your foot in the same direction. Pretty easy, right? Yeah? Okay. Now try moving your foot in the opposite direction. I can't do it right away. You got to think about it a little bit, right? Can you do it? Okay, all right. So at first it's a little tough, right? It's a little tough, and that just goes to show with the separation of the hemispheres of the brain. I think it's interesting to note with our movements on the right side of our body actually focus on the left side, the hemisphere of our brain. And we'll talk about that more in detail, I guess, tomorrow when we get into Broca's area, the Wernicke's area. I always thought that was interesting to do with the motor cortex. Okay, sensory cortex. So right behind the motor cortex and is mostly associated with the parietal lobe. Okay, and that is really just sensory information. So processing this information through sensory neurons, okay, being sent again towards the limbic system where it's associated a lot with and into the sensory cortex. So the thalamus receiving this information, sending it to the appropriate locations like the sensory cortex to be processed a little bit more in detail. All right, so this is a look at what we're talking about. So we'll talk about the Wernicke's area, the Broca's area more tomorrow, okay, and how that's associated with speech and expressive language. But this is what we're looking at. For the quiz, for the assessment, you'll need to know where these locations are, okay, and know the basic functions of the brain and these lobes. Okay, so again, we broke it down, the brainstem, the limbic system, and the cerebral cortex. All right, so, oh yeah, sorry. You good? All right, so with the temporal lobe, we talked about that a little bit with the vocab, but is heavily involved with speech and a little bit of vision. But expressive language, okay, and receptive language focused in the temporal lobe. So a lot of auditory functions, a lot of auditory processing. And again, like I mentioned, expressive language. So when we get to talk about the Wernicke's area, Broca's area tomorrow, okay, that's where we're going to be focused mostly on, is the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, where that's located. And finally, the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, okay? So the occipital lobes, again, split by the hemispheres, but vision, okay? So vision is located in the occipital lobe. So it's interesting to know whenever you're receiving stimulus through vision, right, it's being projected into the back of your brain, the occipital lobe. And we'll talk more in detail about how that occurs and how actually when you're visualizing something, it's upside down and our brain focuses it right side up, which I think is pretty crazy. And the occipital lobe, again, in the back of the brain, right above the cerebellum, okay, with vision. All right, is there any questions on that, guys? You good? Okay. So with the cerebral cortex, I have an assignment for you. Just make sure you can edit it then eventually when we talk about the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, because I like you to add that on to it when we discuss it. So the assignment for today, really just associating these parts, these lobes of the brain, and describing its basic functions. It's right here at the bottom, cerebral cortex. I'd like you guys to complete this assignment. And if you can, if you do a little further research, that'd be great. You can just locate the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area. I know I didn't get to talk about it yet, but if you can locate it on the brain here and just label its basic function, that'd be great. So I have it here color coordinated if you wanted to do that. So if you want to do the frontal lobe green, let's say, you can color this part green where the frontal lobe's located and just describe its basic function. Right? So the motor cortex, right behind the frontal lobe, again, describe its function. So you guys know what we're doing here? So when you're completed with this, you should have the different lobes labeled by color coded, and you can label and describe each part of the brain, the cerebral cortex. All right, you guys know what we're doing? All right, there you go. You have the rest of the time to work on this assignment.